The following content contains material intended for mature audiences. Viewer discretion advised. I gotta tell you today, my lovelies, I may need a moment of silence. I was gardening this weekend and I had to cut off my nails, so I'm feeling like a Bob Barker PSA right now. I went from feral to domesticated. Like, I talk with my hands and now I'm even gonna be distracted by them, so I'm glad you're joining me today. I hope you're doing well. My name is Matter Moment, and for those of you new to the channel, I offer wisdom highlights from a woman's perspective as we put on our highest red bottom slippers and strut our stuff down the silver brick road to the land of wisdom. We'll explore accounts of true crime, dark histories, mysteries, and mayhem in the constant quest of empowerment, knowledge, and the insight to survival. And if you haven't already, don't forget to support the channel, like, subscribe, and share. Today, this story is from across the pond in the UK. The US is not the only country having to deal with serial killers, particularly in the 1970s and 80s. I'm telling you, it's amazing that Gen Xers ever survived childhood. But I do have a question for you I'd like to ponder as I go over the specifics. Why did he do it? Did he want to get caught? Was he feeling ashamed and wanted to be stopped? Was he working on his insanity defense strategy already? Or was it just monumental arrogance and apathy? Okay, so let's get started. The cold morning of February 9th, 1983, in northern London, at a house that was made up of several apartments, investigators knew that they would have to deal with the suspected human remains found in the pipes. But they could not have imagined what they would find on the top floor attic apartment. The previous day, after several complaints from tenants about the sewage pipes backing up in the building, a plumber was summoned to sort the problem out. When he opened the pipes, it was like nothing he ever had seen or smelled. The smell, even for a plumber, was overwhelming. The pipes were filled with putrefying flesh-like material and bones that he could tell had originated from the top floor apartment. He was so concerned and sus about whether they were human that he called his supervisor. The supervisor didn't arrive until dusk, and by then, many of the tenants had been asking questions, including the top floor tenant. The plumbing company's supervisor decided that he would continue either to try and diagnose the issue or call the police the following morning. The next morning, when they returned, the pipes had been suspiciously cleared. The downstairs tenant reported that they had seen the top floor tenant messing about outside during the night. This was just too much for the supervisor to ignore, so he notified the police. When the material was examined by authorities, it was confirmed to be human remains. I'm assuming the supervisor had kept some of the pieces from the night before, or the nighttime plumbing crusader had done a very thorough job. The examiner also stated that on one of the pieces of flesh were strangulation marks confirming homicide. Because we all know that if someone tries to put another human down the drain in pieces, they're likely to try and say the person was already dead. Ray Wilson, Wisconsin, 1954. If you want to know about that ray of sunshine, Ray. If you want to know about that ray of sunshine, watch my Ed Gein video. With confirmation that the human remains were the result of a homicide, detectives went to question the attic tenant. When the tenant opened the door to his apartment, the overwhelming stench of decomposition blasted out towards the detectives like a putrid bomb. The mild man living alone in his apartment was identified as Dennis Nilsen. He was an average, white, slender 37-year-old who seemed a bit underwhelming. Dennis clutched his pearls when the detectives told him about the human flesh and bones that were found coming from his unit. But the detectives were not interested in theatrics and confronted Nilsen not to mess around with lies. He seemed calmly relieved, and when asked where the rest of the body was, he pointed to the wardrobe. As the detectives approached the wardrobe, the nauseating smell became stronger and left no doubt to its contents. 2 large bags were found inside. Without hesitation, Dennis Nilsen was placed under arrest for suspicion of murder and taken to the station. With the discovery of the black bags, the detectives assumed that Dennis had possibly murdered more than one person. However, while in the patrol car on the way to the station, they asked Dennis whether it was 1 or 2 he had murdered. His answer was not what the detectives were prepared for. While gazing out the window emotionless, he replied, 15 or 16. It wasn't until that moment that they realized, with shock and horror, that they were in the presence of a serial killer, one that was ready and willing to talk. Now, Dennis Nilsen worked with a biographer and has an autobiography that was published, so a great deal of Dennis Nilsen's accounts have to be taken with a grain of salt. Actually, fuck that. We need to use our discernment caps and question everything he claims, because it's hard to separate the facts of his life versus his own version of events. He wanted to be known as the murderer of the century, but without actually taking any responsibility for those murders. He, like most serial killers and some people in general, would have been reluctant to truly face his darkness and take responsibility for his actions. preferring to blame others for his mistreatment of him rather than his premeditation in satisfying his desires. So keep that in mind as I continue. Dennis Nilsen was born in Fraserburgh, Aberdeenshire in Scotland on November 23, 1945, the middle of 3 children to Elizabeth and Olav Nilsen. His mother Elizabeth had married Olav, a Norwegian officer stationed in Scotland, but his parents' relationship was not a happy one. Olav was not much in the way of settling down and was away on assignments for the military much of the time. It seems that he was only around enough to get her pregnant every so often. The marriage ended in divorce when Dennis was just under 3. But the dominant male role in Dennis's life was not his father, but his maternal grandfather, Andrew. The Nilsen family had lived with Elizabeth's parents the entirety of their marriage, and Elizabeth and her children continued after the divorce. Dennis greatly loved his grandfather and idolized him. Andrew was a fisherman and could be away for long spells. When he was home, there were long walks in the harbor and in the countryside, and family picnics. Dennis was a little boy who thought that this man was a great hero and protector. When Andrew was at sea, Dennis remembered feeling life would be empty for me until he returned. Andrew adored his little grandson, and the little boy loved him dearly. In 1951, Andrew's health started declining, and while at sea, Andrew, at 62 years old, suffered a fatal heart attack. At 5 years old, Dennis didn't understand death. He didn't understand why his grandfather was lying there in a casket. His mother, weeping, tried to explain her father's death as he was sleeping or he's gone to a better place. But this only confused Dennis further because he wanted to know why his father didn't want to take him with him. The little boy was lost, and unfortunately, this experience may have contributed to his future relationships with the living and with the dead. After the death, Dennis retreated into solitude, grief, and fascination. He didn't want to participate in family activities and was sullen and withdrawn, even when lovingly encouraged. He also was fascinated by the appearance of death. Elizabeth would later move out of her parents' home and eventually remarry. She and her new husband would have 4 other children together. Dennis used his jealousy that his other siblings, including his older brother Olav Jr., were getting more attention and praise to feel unloved and neglected. Dennis would later claim that his mother was, well, basically an ice-cold bitch and lying about having a loving family. He spoke of his childhood as being poor and neglected with no father, no affection, no pictures of himself as a boy, an inwardly troubled boy that nobody seemed to notice. He described himself as small and frail and painted a sad and pathetic picture. At the age of 8 or 10, Dennis realized that he was homosexual and he fell in love with another boy. He said nothing to the other boy or anyone else. He understood that this was unacceptable in his family and society, and with even the possibility of imprisonment. His sexual attractions confused him and left him feeling ashamed, like an outsider or an abomination. He did not act on any of these desires with any of his friends, but he did at one point molest his little sister and older brother, Olav Jr., while he was sleeping. This led to Olav Jr. ridiculing Dennis as a hen, slang for girl or being gay. This both humiliated and enraged him. Dennis also remembered being molested by an older youth, but he didn't find that unpleasant. Having been an above-average student, Dennis eventually decided that he wanted more from life than his mother and stepfather had settled for in a quiet little town. He joined the army thinking that it would give him opportunity and travel, which it did. Dennis had a military career as a chef and was stationed at different parts of the UK, Germany, Norway, and his most dangerous, the state of Aden, which is now part of Yemen. In Aden, he had saw service members killed and had his own near-death experience when he was mugged by a taxi driver. He excelled and did very well, focusing his efforts on his career. It was during these years that not only Dennis was the happiest, but he explored his desires and fantasy without revealing a hint of his dark side to anyone else. While in the service, Dennis enjoyed joining the camaraderie of his fellow soldiers, but he was able to keep a certain level of privacy. He joined in their shenanigans with the work hard, play hard motto, often including significant amounts of alcohol. Even though he kept his sexual orientation private, he came to realize that he was attracted to slender, young men that were either unconscious or dead. Knowing that his army service would be over if he were caught coming on to another service member, he managed his impulses. He would shower alone, and while stationed in Aden, he was given his own room. This gave Dennis the opportunity to explore his sexual fantasies. He had a mirror that he would place in such a way that he could look at his own nakedness and imagine himself in sexual situations with a passive body or being the unconscious body. He fantasized about dead service members that he had seen while incorporating his own brushes with death and aspects of an oil painting, The Raft of Medusa by Theodore Jacques. The painting depicted the moment survivors saw rescue after 13 days at sea after a French ship they were on had run aground in 1816 off the coast of Mauritania. The massive art piece is particularly gruesome and detailed in its likeness of death, madness, and resignation. It's a fascinating story, and I've done a video on the events and the painting if you're curious, so check that out. But Dennis was most enraptured by the old man in the scene, holding the body of a young, slender, dead man, while another half body is lying close by. He was turned on by the thought of the old, dirty daddy dominating his lifeless, spread-eagled companion. There are two things that Dennis claimed that are very Freudian here, and wrap up everything in a convenient little fucking bow, if you ask me. First, Dennis stated that as a teen, he had a near-death experience while swimming at the beach. He became caught in a current and was drowning, and he kept thinking that his grandfather was going to come save him, and had this sudden feeling of tranquility come over him. He was eventually saved by someone else. Second, Dennis also implied the possibility of his grandfather sexually molesting him. This has never been confirmed or proven or even mentioned prior to his arrest. To me, it seemed like another place to put the blame. Again, people who are sexually assaulted, molested, and abused don't generally turn into serial killers. Oh, what a good boy. I'm going to say hi. Cuteness aggression alert. His description of the dead that he had seen with his grandfather and the fellow soldiers, his near drowning, the molestation, and the imagery of the Raft of Medusa implied a logical equation that would equal the result of his actions. Again, I cannot stress enough. He was a serial killer. Grain of salt. After 11 years in the military and a fracturing with his family over his homosexuality, Dennis decided to move to London and join the police force at the end of 1972. He enjoyed his position at the police force, but it was not a substitute for his isolation that the army was. He missed the camaraderie. In response, he started frequenting gay bars and pubs and having casual encounters. Casual encounters. It sounds like a late-night Skinemax show that David Duchovny would have hosted. London in the late 1970s was much like the rest of the developed world, having a rough go with an economic downturn. Unemployment was leaving a generation of young people with little prospects and or hope of advancement. They would come from the outlying areas to London for opportunity, but none was forthcoming, leading many to desperate measures, including homelessness and sex work. This was just the environment ripe for Dennis. He eventually left the police force, stating that it was because of homophobia, and began working in a job at a job recruitment center. With his days at the job center and nights at the bars, Dennis had plenty of opportunity to meet young, vulnerable men. He met and tried to have a relationship with a 20-year-old man named David Gallican in 1975. I hope I'm saying that right. Gallican would later deny that he and Dennis were in a homosexual relationship together, although Gallican stayed home, redecorated the garden apartment that they rented together, and let Dennis be the breadwinner. They lived in separate bedrooms, rarely had intercourse, and eventually each brought home casual sexual partners. So, yeah. The relationship ended with Gallican moving out in 1977 after repeated verbal altercations, but no violence. Dennis continued to try to have long-lasting relationships, but none of the men that he chose wanted the same. None were interested in living with Dennis. With these failed experiences, Dennis seemed to be coming to the conclusion that he was unfit to live with. It was increasingly obvious that he desperately wanted companionship, but he couldn't get around the pesky business of developing himself enough to be loved. Tedious, I know. He began to realize that a companion with the ability to oppose him was not tolerable. Dennis needed someone without the ability to have their own needs, wants, or desired. Someone without a pulse. I have researched so many cases that this BS is just getting fucking old. This shit just drives me crazy about the patriarchal system. The profound entitlement that allows men to feel required to have someone to meet their needs rather than develop and take care of themselves, while women are told that no one is going to rescue you, you're your own savior. We placate to men's feelings and tiptoe around their comfort while making sure that wives, mothers, sisters, and daughters are strong, and if they do anything wrong, we blame them and vilify them. We blame them for the actions of the husbands and the sons. We blame them for not being beautiful enough or too beautiful, letting herself go, or being too dolled up, being too smart, not being smart enough, being too strong, or ice cold, or not loving, or coddling. And God forbid she voice an opinion, because then she's just being hysterical, emotional, or worse, she's a bitch. We can expect better from men. I'm not saying that this is the only wrong thing with these guys, but it's a huge problem. Okay, back to Dennis. Dennis had established a pattern with finding young men who were homeless, hungry, and usually rent boys or sex workers, those in a state of desperation and need. He would offer to give them a place to stay for the night, a meal, or more drinks and music. Once at his place, he would continue his gentle, mild-mannered, well-off older guy daddy image with the luxuries that he had in his flat. But the morning of December 31st, 1978, as Stephen Holmes lies sleeping next to Dennis, his fears and insecurities about being left by Stephen when he woke would dominate his logic. Dennis decided that the 14-year-old boy would be celebrating the new year with him, whether he wanted to or not. 14. While the boy was still asleep, Dennis straddled him and strangled him to unconsciousness with a necktie, and then drowned him in a bucket of water. He then washed the body and lay him back onto the bed, caressing the body and, acting out the fantasies to at this point had only lived in his mind. After he was finished, he placed Stephen's corpse under the ground floor apartment floorboards, so he could later take him out and, brushing maggots aside, would continue his sick practice. And this would become Dennis's MO. He would pick up a vulnerable, homeless, young, slender man or boy, convince him to come back to his flat with him on the promise of shelter, food, drinks, strangled him to unconsciousness or death, and if the victim was still alive, he would drown him in the sink, tub, or a bucket of water until dead. He would wash and shave the body, then he would lie on the bed with it while he complimented and caressed it. Then he would sexually gratify himself. He would then place the victim in the dirt under the floorboards for later disinterment and defilement. During these disinterment sessions, Dennis would wash the bodies and apply makeup or talc powder to hide a new blemish of decay. He also stated later, almost as if he were talking about a profound love so great that he would be moved to emotion when he described how beautiful the bodies were. You're back? He did everything to diminish any semblance of the body having been a living person. Dennis would burn all the belongings, IDs, clothes, anything that would define them as someone other than his toy. He would place them on a chair or in the apartment where they would keep him company while he watched TV, or he would converse with them. After he would use them sexually to satisfy himself, he would then place them back again under the floorboards. After weeks or sometimes months of keeping multiple decaying bodies under the apartment floorboards, Dennis was in constant daily struggle to keep the persistent smell and presence of flies at bay with deodorizers and insecticides. He eventually ran out of space under the floorboards and used any other available space, beneath the kitchen sink, in the cupboards, suitcases, in the garden shed. And finally, when he would run out of places to store the bodies, he decided to dismember his victims and dispose of them. For some victims, Dennis would cut off their head, hands, and feet and boil the flesh off. Then he would cremate them in a bonfire in an empty area behind the building of his flat. To disguise the smell of burning flesh, he would add a tire on top of the burning heap. These bonfires would last all day, and when only bones remained, he would grind up those bones and bury them in the garden. In total, he had 3 of these sessions in 3 years that he lived at the Melrose Avenue location to dispose of 12 boys and young men that he had murdered. In 1982, Dennis's landlord offered him £1,000 to vacate the flat for renovations. My guess is that this was just an excuse to get him out of the building. But okay, so this is London. I know that London is a big place, but people live quite close to one another. How is this okay? These awful smelling bonfires were okay? The stench of multiple bodies rotting only brought a paid offer to vacate rather than the police? No one thought this was strange? And what did the owner find when he was going through the flat that Dennis had just left? While looking for a new flat, Dennis decided that he would turn over a new leaf and refrain from killing any more young men or boys. Or anyone. He wanted to find a new location that would not have any possible spots to hide a decaying body or two, or more. He decided on a top floor flat without any space under the floorboards and no garden in the back, and that worked out so well. After all, this was where his ineffective disposal habits came to the attention of police. Once at the station, Dennis, much like he was with his lifeless companions, was a chatterbox and eager to end his crippling isolation. At one point, he tried the "I woke up and they were dead" line, but he couldn't maintain the silence of not talking about his crimes. It seems he was eager to kill and tell. Sorry, low-hanging fruit. He went into detail about the crimes that he had committed and the locations of the bodies, including the former Melrose Avenue residence. Imagine the occupant of his old flat when the police showed up wanting to investigate bodies having been stored under their floorboards. Dennis also let investigators know they could locate the partial remains of several victims in various locations throughout his current flat. Inside one of the 2 black plastic bags in the wardrobe were 2 dissected torsos and a bag of internal organs. In the other bag was a human skull, a severed head, and a torso with arms but no hands. There were remains in a tea chest and in drawers. And okay, I'm not British, so I had to look up what a tea chest is. And as you might expect, it holds tea. It's not very big, which makes me wonder, what was he keeping there? Were they trophies? Were all the bodies trophies at the scene? Dennis gave them descriptions of how the young boys and men were killed, each experience having unique features, but yet he didn't know their names. Like other serial killers, what makes them psychopaths is their ability to see people as nothing but objects to satisfy their needs. He also described the storage of the bodies in various places of both apartments and the disposal of the bodies. Dennis said to an interviewing detective, "I have no tears for my victims, no tears for myself, nor those bereaved by my actions. I wished I could stop, but I couldn't. I had no other thrill or happiness. I worshiped the art and the act of death." Dennis Nilsen was charged with 6 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. They only charged him according to the victims that they could ID and those they had evidence for. He was tried at the Old Bailey October 1983. At first, he wanted to plead guilty, but he was convinced by his defense attorney to plead not guilty by reason of mental defect. His defense attorneys were aware that they could do nothing about whether or not Nilsen committed the homicides. Rather, they hoped to get Nilsen the lighter sentence with a lesser conviction of manslaughter. If only convicted of manslaughter, he would serve 15 years in a mental institution and then be released. His lawyers retained 2 psychiatrists whose evaluations determined that Dennis was mentally deficient, resulting in diminished responsibility when he murdered. They tried to establish that Nilsen's actions were not premeditated, therefore without insanity. He was only mad when he killed. However, the prosecution was not about to let that shit go down. They couldn't live with the possibility of this predator getting out of prison. So the prosecution had their own psychiatric evaluation done of Dennis Nilsen and found that yes, he had some mental abnormalities and he was highly manipulative. Sagittarius. But he knew right from wrong and was not acting out of uncontrollable impulse. Of course, not only did they have the psychiatric rebuttal, but also a plethora of evidence and confessions while he was in a lucid, sane state that he himself provided. But the prosecution needed to prove that Nilsen was sane at the moment he murdered his victims. They needed to prove premeditation. They needed to prove that he planned the murders before they had occurred. They were able to find victims that had survived Nilsen, that gave testimony to the fact that Nilsen made decisions before these acts to prove sanity and premeditation, contrary to what the defense was claiming. The whole defense strategy was pretty ridiculous, but the prosecution was not going to take any chances. The defense was undoubtedly aware of the stigma of Dennis Nilsen's victims' profiles as well, some of them being homosexual. They must have been betting on the fact that those victims that had survived Nilsen would be hesitant to testify against him because of the ridicule that they would endure from society, family, and friends during the trial. To make matters worse, the defense attorneys vilified the victims as well, blaming the victims for their lack of judgment and lifestyle. But for those that survived their near-death encounters with Nilsen, they were determined to seek justice for themselves, the victims that could no longer speak, and the future of victims in a society that was seeking to humiliate individuals like them. When the jury came back for the verdict, it was not unanimous, but it was a majority vote. Guilty on 6 counts of murder and 2 attempted murder, with a possibility of parole after 25 years. Thank God this sentence was later changed to without the possibility of parole, or whole life tariff, which right now, as a U.S. citizen, the word tariff is a bit triggering. RIP fiscal responsibility and advancements. Dennis Nilsen died due to complications of surgery in May of 2018 at the age of 72. I do want to mention that there are some victims that he tried to kill that were able to get away. Because of the public shame and ridicule, some didn't go to the police. Those that did were largely ignored or regarded as lovers' spats, much like in the case of Dahmer's victims that almost got away. So, for today's Roman wisdom highlights. Number 1, self-reflection. Problems can't be solved unless they're recognized as one, and the likelihood that it's something about oneself is a real possibility. What if people decide to be adults and take some responsibility for their actions? It might actually work in the end. Just a crazy thought. Number 2, political offices should be given to qualified people, not loyalists for self or political gain. And just to be clear, the definition of a loyalist is a person who remains loyal to an established ruler or a government, especially in the face of a revolt. Viva la revolution! You'll have to watch the Raft of the Medusa video to understand, but it had to be said. Number 3, if you have a rental property, don't be that guy. You know, the guy who's willing to ignore complaints from other tenants about the horrendous smells coming from the sus guy's apartment. If for no other reason, then check it out at least for your own investment's sake. Don't be that guy who ignores the sus shit. Side note, I know that Dennis had control issues. The whole strangulation and revival method is absolutely about control. The power of controlling the line between life and death. But hear me out. He also had a fascination with youth and beauty. He was deaf looking for this marble-like figure from his fantasies. Cold, white, perfectly chiseled, lean and muscular, unmoving. I morbidly wonder if it was possible that he strangled them to unconsciousness, but not death, because he wanted to preserve the look of the sleeping beauty. Death by strangulation can leave someone with undesirable evidence of death, whereas drowning may not. It would leave the appearance of peacefulness. It's just my observation of why he may not have gone through with the death by strangulation. Let me know what your thoughts are on why he wanted to render his victims unconscious only to drown them. Now, what do you think about the question, why did he do it? I'm not asking why he killed. I'm asking why his motivation for allowing himself a collection of bodies. Clearly, he knew that trying to store several bodies at a time under the floorboards was drawing unwanted insects and a nauseating smell that he was constantly trying to cover up. So, do you think he was subconsciously wanting to get caught? Was he working on his insanity defense? Or was he just too arrogant in his fantasies to care about such trivial things? Also, I wanted to add this because I thought it was interesting. When I went to his birth chart and his mood is in Cancer, it said because of their strong attachment to and memory of the past, others complained that Moon and Cancer natives tend to whip a dead horse. Wow. They may dwell on hurts long after everyone else has moved on. When they feel that they have been taken for granted, which may be often, they don't always confront others directly. This is when they can use roundabout ways to get attention. In fact, these natives can become quite manipulative when feeling insecure. They can also be enslaved to habit. Yeah, let me know what you think on that. It's kind of interesting. There is a 3-part series available on AMC Plus starring David Tennant as Dennis Nilsen called Des. Now, I love David Tennant, but holy shit. Watching this gave me the creeps. He looked like a fucking dead ringer to Dennis Nilsen and did a great job portraying him. I was totally creeped out. I would recommend giving it a watch. Thank you for listening to the end. I really appreciate it. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to check out my other videos about true crime and the video I did about the Raft of the Medusa that inspired Dennis. And like I said, please let me know your theories on Dennis Nilsen and his motivations. And if you have any comments and questions, leave them down below. I am absolutely curious about what your thoughts are. So thank you for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Be safe, and sending you silver streaks of wisdom.